Thank you to everybody who has joined our session this evening. My name is Kathryn Schneider, and I'm in the Art Histories Master's program here at TCU. Thank you for joining this evening. I'm joined by my fellow classmate, Emma Thompson. She's managing our technology this evening. Thank you, Emma, for working through our early technical difficulties. Hopefully that sets us up to be successful for the remaining of the session. But tonight we're kicking off our educational programming for our faculty exhibition. Interpreting Renditions of Nature, Community, and Self presents 26 works of art by the artists of the TCU's permanent faculty in the School of Art. Their artworks in this exhibition represents the practices and interests of 11 individuals. Their art becomes a mode of communication, and each artist offers a distinct voice as they explore their relationships with identity, community, and nature. So this session tonight is focusing on our theme of nature. The remaining sessions will focus on our two other sub-themes, so respectively self and community. But to lead our session this evening, we're joined by Dr. Lee Hallman. Lee Hallman was most recently the Associate Curator at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. She began a new position this month as the Curator of a distinguished private art collection. At the Modern, she directed and edited the recent catalog of the museum's permanent collection entitled Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth Collection Highlights. Her exhibition credits at the museum include Julie Bozzi, American Food, Spaces and Places, Works from the Collection, and David Parker Retrospective. Thank you, Lee, for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And then we're also joined by our panelists who are Kalee Appleton, the Assistant Professor of Photography, Drone Beuys, which is the collaborative team. They pay homage to the performance artist and sculptor Joseph Beuys. Nick Bontrager is here tonight representing the team. So, and then we're also joined by Dick Lane, who's the director of the School of Art, and Chris Powell, Associate Professor of Art. So thank you to, first of all, just wanted to start with a thank you to our panelists and to our moderator for joining us this evening. I'm really excited to hear the conversation. Our session tonight, just to go through a few ground rules and logistics. As you can see, it's organized in a panel format. Following the prepared questions, we'll close with questions from the audience. So if you all could prepare those questions and submit them in the comment section on the Facebook Live event, Emma Thompson will be fielding those later in the session. But I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Lee to moderate our discussion. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Kathryn, and thanks, Emma. Very glad to be here with all of you. I'm sorry to say I have not seen the show yet, but I've looked at it online and have really enjoyed getting to know the work and a little bit about the artists. So just to jump right into this theme of nature, this is an incredibly broad topic, obviously, and I think that that's reflected in the diversity of ideas and media that we see in this section of the show. I was just, thinking about the topic of nature today and, all the different things that can mean. I mean, we've got human nature and physical nature and the natural landscape and everything that entails, all the life forms within that. Nature can be as small as a blade of grass, or it can be as vast as the cosmos. Nature can be wild, or it can be cultivated and culturally mediated. And of course, nature lies at the heart of one of our most urgent crises, climate change. So I thought maybe we could start by just, I just wanted to invite all the artists to speak a little bit more about how nature informs your work and your practice and what it is about nature that's important to your work now. Anyone can start.
I'll go ahead and start. My picture's on the screen, so it seems like a good place to start. As it turns out, after looking over a long period of time that I've been making work starting in grad school, I would say nature/landscape has always been a portion of what I was doing. Previously, I kind of used it as the background of other things, psychological interpretations, things like that. But in the past 10 years, I've really concentrated on doing things that are more directly about nature and my response to that.
Okay.
Well, I'll jump in. I don't know why you guys put me in nature. No. You know, I've looked at the natural world even before I recognized that I was an artist, you know, just making things out of natural materials. So my connection maybe is more material based than anything else, you know, using natural materials to make objects.
Mm-hmm.
Materials at hand even, you know, not necessarily natural materials.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll come back in later questions to hear a little bit more specifically about that, because I'm very interested in how you've used, you know, found materials and transformed them. And so maybe Nick or Katie, would you like to talk about how nature informs your work in a general sense, and what it is about nature that's, you know, is important for you to address today?
Let's see how I relate to nature and kind of my interest in it. I think it lies with my childhood, in that on a regular basis, my family would take trips to national parks, and we'd go hiking. And so a lot of my early memories are just hiking around nature and going to different parts of the US and just being submerged in nature. So I think that is that was the seed, not to be cliche
Mm-hmm.
or punny, but that was the seed. And so that's definitely something that I think is always kind of going through my mind when I'm making work.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that maps and how the landscape is mediated has always been pretty central to what I am making or working on in the works in the show. Specifically, the landscape is involved, but when I'm in the landscape, a lot of my thoughts are centered around the idea of this invisible boundary that might be present on, you know, a map or a trail map or some kind of prescribed border of a country or state, etc. But also just on the idea that many of us, when we're on those trails or in these natural places, want to see the edge of something, whether it's a vista or a trailhead. And I really enjoy the idea of finding those boundaries with my body, or when I'm in the landscape, the same way that you would, you know, naturally want to draw all the way to the edge of the paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Landscape, I mean, that's, you know, one of the big sort of, you know, concepts in art that has to do with nature. And of course, you know, landscape art has a very rich and complex history, particularly in painting and photography. And I mean, looking at the work in the exhibition, I mean, it seems like all of you in some way, whether directly or indirectly, are engaging with this history. You know, it's a history that's completely intertwined with human civilization and developments in science. And then in, you know, darker ways, it's impossible to extricate landscape art from histories of exploration and colonialism. And you know, Adam is not with us tonight, but, you know, his paintings, I know, refer to that specifically. And his, you know, he engages really carefully with the old master and the romantic landscape tradition. So I was going to ask all of you, you know, how do you see yourselves as working either within or against the history of landscape art, or the history of natural representation, and why? Maybe Dick, you could start again.
Yeah, you know, the work specifically in this show really relates very much to the history of photography. This piece in particular, if I could just describe it really briefly, the color photo on the outside is my image. the black and white photo in the middle of it is actually from a postcard of a William Henry Jackson picture from exactly the same place. And, you know, I will say one of the things when I started doing all landscape photography in general, I found myself in places that photographers had already been. And I don't, you know, some of us through just sort of family history, but some of us through photo history too. And I have no doubt that that has affected the places that I wanted to go see and experience. You know, Nick and I went to Yosemite not too terribly long ago. And, you know, that really harkens back to Timothy O'Sullivan, who was photographing there, Ansel Adams, who was photographing there. And so I've been sort of attracted to those places that were photographed in the 1800s. And now as a contemporary artist and trying to figure out, you know, there's a nice sort of connection over the history of time between those. And in some ways it you know, it really makes me feel very strongly a part of the family of photography.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible to, I mean, our whole, you know, so much of our vision and our mythology of what the West is, especially, comes out of that photographic tradition of Carlton Watkins and William Henry Jackson and Ansel Adams. And I know that Kalee, you're also kind of connected to that history. And I mean, you do very different kinds of things with the photographic material you're starting with, and actually, you know, manipulating it almost beyond recognition. So I was going to see, you know, how you see yourself working either within or against that tradition.
Right. Yeah, I think it's pivotal to understanding the work in that, and a lot of people don't realize this. You'd almost have to talk to me, come to one of these panels or read my artist statement. But these images that I'm using are appropriated photographic backdrops that would be used in a portrait studio. So my interest in these is as objects, but also as kind of this journey that landscape photography has taken from the origins in the history of landscape photography. And even really, you could argue the history of landscape painting, because originally these backdrops would have been painted. And kind of how all these kind of idealized landscapes have in a way become so ubiquitous that, you know, even though these are manipulated, you know exactly what that landscape looks like. And that's what kind of interests me about these is that journey that these types of photographies or types of photographs have taken, and they endure. They're enduring into the Zoom age, like, you know, our backgrounds that we're putting behind us.
Right.
So I find that really fascinating. And when I'm manipulating them, I'm really interested in showing their objecthood, and that yes, this is a photograph, but it's also a photograph of a photograph. And that's kind of what's going on in these. And then of course the one on the right is a ready-made. I did not take it, I just appropriated that image and just a found object from a photo store.
I was curious about your frames, actually. I mean, some of the forms actually look like, you know, it could be like a country from a map, or I was wondering, you know, what the source of the shapes were and the materials.
Actually, I love that. And that was kind of, it's convenient that these are very reminiscent of like county lines or maps. And I love that. But they are I kind of got the backdrops and crumpled them up and rephotographed them. So these are the exact shape that the crumpled photograph made. And so I was strategic in how I kind of manipulated it in order to kind of create these organic shapes to kind of go along with the organic nature. And I also was very cognizant in wanting them to mimic the landscape in some way. So allowing the display method to speak to the subject matter, I think was really important to those pieces.
Okay. Nick, you mentioned your interest in mapping, and yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about, how the work of Drone Beuys, engages with that history of surveillance, and talk about the different tools you're using and how, what you're doing is very different than a, kind of traditional mapping. And yeah, I mean, this video, I love Marfa and West Texas especially. So, just the place itself is so important. So yeah.
It's a wonderful place that has such a great connection to either the history of the landscape, the events, or previous owners, but also my interest in kind of mapping is also a bit tied to how I really loved Kalee's explanation about the silhouettes that were created by crumpling the backdrops and thinking about this portrait of something that is hard to shrink or to capture all in one image. And so the idea of crumpling it or compressing it, and that's similar to what's happening and how Adam and I were exploring this side of a road in Marfa for the video piece in the show, and at the same time using technology that has become available to us basically by demilitarized funding or funding through defense contracts that has allowed either technology to leak or creep into recreational territory and hobby use. But at the same time, looking at countries where drone strikes are responsible for a multitude of civilian deaths, and you would find pamphlets in the ground that are how to avoid how to not be seen by a drone, and occasionally that would encompass covering yourself in a reflective blanket. And so that's a big part of what's tied to the gesture. And this video is Adam off of frame directing me to move around through this landscape while I'm hiding the visible trace of myself, and he's just watching from above, hovering from about 100 feet above the landscape, saying go left, go right. And really the only human trace of my figure is this long shadow where I'm still there, despite doing my best to kind of hide myself among the rocks in the landscape.
Yeah. I thought maybe, do you want to explain to the audience about the Beuys reference and the gold foil? Because I thought that was,
Sure. Yeah, that's a big part of it. And most of it comes from this sending jokes back and forth with Adam as we were beginning our first early stages of working together. And I think one of us had photoshopped a drone in the arms of Joseph Beuys. There's an image that always comes up with one of his works where he's covered his face in gold leaf and he's holding a dead rabbit. And in our version, he was holding a small drone that had crashed. And it became this kind of rich joke with a lot of layers that was also tied to the, kind of a narrative connection to the landscape and myth making, and made a lot of sense as a starting point for where so many of our interests in shared image making or video making or sound making were headed, but also the idea of that protective blanket that can encapsulate a precious object in the same way that a satellite may have this gold blanket protecting it from radiation when NASA launches something into space. This idea of the precious element that is highly prized, that is somehow protecting something that is more precious within. And so a big part of that was not only the existence of these foil blankets in both the canon of art, science, and exploration, the idea of the unknown, and thinking about this one object as a protective element to warn yourself if you're lost in the woods, or protecting your interstellar journey. And so it's become this common item in the toolkit that can be used to mask or encapsulate or just shroud something that we're working on.
And Chris, your work is a bit different in that, you're not looking at views of landscapes or images of landscape, but you're actually using materials from nature, and sometimes found objects. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, how you think you connect to the idea of landscape.
So I make a lot of different things, and there is a body of work that I call tableau, in which I do replicate the landscape, and they're always highly reduced, so that a plane, if it's a flat plane, it's going to be super, super flat. If it's a set of stairs, they're going to be very jagged stairs. So reduction is a big part of that when I'm trying to represent nature. But more to your question about kind of taking things from nature and playing on them. I'm thinking that I'm always looking for something that might trigger something that I could respond to on a real physical level, So to the point of the houses piece, I'm really interested in the way an insect works, and then I see that they're building their nests, to lay their eggs in, and I've been around them all my life. Oddly enough, just this week, I stuck my hand in the glove that was in the kiln area, and there was a mud dauber's nest in it. So I take this mud dauber's nest out, and I think, yeah, I'll fire this one too. Now, I'm getting way off the question, but I'm real careful not to fire one if it still has the eggs in it. And I'm cautious to only take them if they come apart without crumbling. And then let me go back to your question a little bit about just taking things out of nature and using them, or just not even nature, from my environment. The broken pots, are sitting around useless, and I like the idea of history and giving something more life. So I'm putting those guys back together. I don't think I answered your question at all, Lee.
That's okay. These are very broad questions and open-ended too. So the planters, I mean, these were pots that you already had in your possession.
That's
and
right.
Tell us what have you done with them?
So let me back up a little bit. When the committee saw it, the piece was 2 flower pots that I'd put back together and one that was still broken. And over the winter break, I decided to put, you'll see in the installation shot, a little black plastic pot. Well, I was still putting the other one back together. And if you go into the gallery today, you'll see 3 planters that have been put back together. I have always glued things back together. I like to restore things. And so several years ago, the pulpit minister with the group that I worship with asked me to learn kintsugi, because you put it together and it's more beautiful because of its brokenness. Well, I must have been so broken I couldn't do that. I got all the materials, all the lacquer and all the gold, and I studied up on the Japanese process, and I couldn't get it to work. But with a rougher hand, I can take glue or I can take refractory cement and put stuff back together. So I may never be that kintsugi artist, but I will continue to put things back together and give them history.
And of course, I mean, there's all kinds of natural resonances of those phenomenon. So yeah, I think it's great. And so my last question was about art history and landscape as a concept, but today, looking forward, I mean, it's impossible to think about nature without thinking about modern technology. I mean, it's whether we're approaching nature through technology or whether we're turning away from technology and seeking refuge in nature. And some of you, as we've already touched on, are using very cutting edge technological tools, drones and lasers and software, and then other works I think are kind of addressing that more indirectly. So I guess my question is, how do you all think that technology has changed our relationship to nature, and how can art help us to negotiate that changing relationship? Does anybody want to start?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I can jump in. So for me, a big part of how various technology has allowed me to change those visits to a place or to a landscape or location is to be able to create a non-invasive investigation of a space. No longer am I touching something that may be fragile or endangered, or by walking to a location, I am trampling or creating a path that would take so many years for the landscape to heal. The use of seeing over great distances through the aid of technology has just been really wonderful, in the same way that earlier in the discussion you were talking about the American West expansion and the way that a camera lens can document and map a space. It's the same way, where by creating a record from a drone or from a laser scanner, it allows me to treat it a little bit more as a less fragile, expendable resource in my studio. So I can feel comfortable knowing that, ethically, I can cut this landscape into chunks and pieces and smash it and put it back together again. And I have not necessarily impacted how someone else will be able to experience that location for the first time or the last time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a sense of responsibility to the land, and using these tools for well, I guess I'd just say better ends, and more interesting ends, and more reflective ends. So and Kalee, how about you? How do you think technology has changed our relationship to nature, and how does that affect your work?
Well, I think a lot about photography, and photography was one of the very first media that that did incorporate like a technological aspect in terms of like the mechanical reproduction. So it was one of the early ones. It brought photographs of the West to us so we could see what it looked like. So in a way, it did bring us closer, and us meaning like civilization, bringing us closer in that we know what it looks like now and we can enjoy it from afar. And I think it's kind of continued that, in that even with the internet or with like our digital means, we're talking to each other during a pandemic. It's this really wonderful group of tools that we can use, but at the same time, it's no, you can't replace nature with it. It can only really bring you to a certain extent, and then it stops. And then there's really no, I guess, substitute for nature, even though like all of the tools that we've been using can kind of bring us a little bit closer. There's just no substitute for it. Mm-hmm. And that's how I kind of think about it, and maybe that's why I love photography so much, that it gets me out and away from my computer and out and away from, you know, essentially like work. So I think it's helped, and at the same time it's maybe hindered us in that it in some ways has prevented us from maybe being more submerged into nature than maybe what we normally would have been without it.
I think about, you know, just how, you know, photography with social media and everything else is, you know, so ubiquitous. There are more images in our world than ever before. And, you know, can we still have sort of an authentic experience with nature? Or, you know, so much of it is mediated through, you know, our sort of expressions of our experiences, or, you know, thinking about our experiences even while they're happening, in terms of, you know, the technology that's, you know, a part of our everyday lives.
Right. It seems to have, it's unfortunately has kind of taken over, and I find myself wanting to get away from my phone, getting away from my computer. And I hope that there's going to be a rejection of it, maybe after all of this is over, a rejection of technology to a certain extent. Something else just related to my work is I use all like software, and I use a CNC router, which has really given me a lot of freedom from the square, the frame that we're all like perfectly centered in. And that's just another aspect that I think about whenever what came to mind whenever you asked that question, is like, there's a sense of freedom in that the possibilities are literally endless now. But at the same time, there is a little bit of a glass wall that we like bump up next to, and then we're limited. It's almost like being in a glass cage a little bit. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Dick, I know, I mean, your work engages technology, and I think especially in looking at, you know, how technology can both distance us and bring us closer to nature. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, and you know, this particular group that is in the show, it really, in a lot of ways, the technology allowed me to connect. I mean, Nick talked about the sort of mythology of the landscape on a really personal level. For me, you know, I'm a born and raised Texan, and you know, my mom was raised out in Pecos, and you know, out in Alpine, and so that area that we were talking about, Marfa, all of that resonates with me. But you know, looking back, it allows me to also connect with this kind of family history that I can't imagine that I would have ever connected with before. So in a lot of ways, you know, I saw pictures of these places as a child, heard all the relatives talk about it. And, you know, so my family migrated from Scotland in the Great Migration and all of that. And so there's all that sort of history that I can now sort of connect with in terms of migration, in terms of being immigrants in a space. And I just don't see how that would have been possible without this technology. And I'll, you know, say what one of my teachers said in grad school, which was, you know, each of these things that we use is just a tool. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. You can use it however you want to. And there's certainly some bad things about the technology. You know, I will say it drives me crazy when my students come in and they want to make pictures like Instagram filters. That one in particular drives me a little nuts. So there's, you know, there's other things where it's a good thing. But I would also say what's really interesting to me is all of us that we're talking to tonight, we're actually all connected in that same sort of way in terms of technology. I mean, I've worked with Chris doing things, doing animals and small things. Nick and I have a similar interest in maps. And, you know, I remember asking Kalee if one of the shapes on her work was about maps. And, you know, I think we're all sort of connected, and it helps because of the technology too. So it's interesting how it can pull people together, and they can use it in a way like talking about their family history or other things. So yeah, it's impacted my life in a way it's hard to describe.
Okay, yeah. And what about you, Chris? How does technology enter into your thinking?
So firing clay is the oldest technology, maybe, but I won't go there. Let's see. You said something about responsibility to the land that I really liked when you were asking. Maybe it was Nick. I just love that phrase. One of the current things that I've got going is a kiln site in Arkansas that we've used the clay right from the site to build the kiln, and use the clay from the place to make the work, and use the wood from the place to fire the pieces. So that kind of technology. I tell my students that if it's hurt by being exposed to water or fire, don't put me around it. So computers are fall into that category. If you get them wet or get them too hot, they're no good. So it's a problem.
That ties into I got a list of questions from Kathryn that I guess some of the graduate students had put together, and one of the questions that they posed was, you know, what obligations do you as artists feel that we have to our environments? So, you know, you've just sort of,
let me just keep up going with that, because clay, you know, is really fuel, and it uses a lot of fuel. And most clay production is based on fossil fuel. And then you're putting all of those carbons back in the air. So it's really tough issue for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if I look at this through the lens of a photography, I think of, thank you, Nick. I think about how early on the chemicals that were used in photography were very bad for nature. And now we're so much more cognizant of it that, you know, I think there's even certain states that you can even get film developed because of the ramifications of the chemicals on nature.
Well, we actually had the EPA come through. This was before we hired Hailey, but the EPA came through with 5 scientists with clipboards and computers, and basically they asked how we ran the lab. And at that time we had a bit of a wet lab, and they said, well, you can't put that down the drain anymore.
Right.
And it's like, I get it, because we were recycling the silver out of the fixer. I mean, we were trying our best to be good stewards by recycling as much of the chemistry as we could, using it for as long as we could. We, you know, did those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, I think we all have a great deal of responsibility in terms of that, in terms of, you know, just the integrity of what it is we're trying to do. Is not about destroying things, but it's about sort of building things. And I think all of us are really cognizant of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, always having it in the back of your mind about, and this is just in terms of process, you know, there's so many other things in terms of like conceptual ideas associated with the land that, you know, that's probably something we could talk about right after this. But in terms of process, I think I try to be really cognizant of, like, whenever I use, I'm very well aware that I use a significant amount of wood whenever I go to make my frames, but I make sure that I maximize that space in that wood to make sure that I'm wasting as least amount of wood as possible. And with chemicals, like being really careful about and expressing this to students too, like, hey, you can do film, but you have to be careful. We have to protect the environment, and teaching people how to be safe and to think about that at the same time. I think just us as educators is really important to us, really important aspect of our jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I guess maybe one of my last questions is, I'm curious how the experience of the past year has affected all of your work. I mean, I think about myself and how my life has changed through the pandemic, and thinking about nature. I mean, I think probably most of us have stayed closer to home than we have in a very long time. And for me, at least, I find myself paying closer attention than ever to, the nature that's right around me. And, yeah, it's changed my own relationship to my sense of place in Fort Worth. I'm from Fort Worth originally, but I moved back to Fort Worth about 3.5 years ago. But we're all busy professionals and traveling and all that, but this year has really kind of been a reset moment in terms of my relationship to place and nature. So I was going to ask you all, how has this affected your work and your practice, and what are you working on now?
I can talk about that. I had been working on my current body of work that I'm really working on. Of course, I was like, oh, I'm a landscape artist, I'm going to do landscape. Mm-hmm. And then when this hit, it quickly transitioned to flowers. And then not just flowers, but flowers that I found on walks. And that really just almost happened immediately, where I was like, I need to look at something that is going to make me feel better. And so it's kind of this positivity and an embrace. It's trying to surround myself with positivity, which are these flowers that I see my neighbors plant in their flower beds. And then also it's like embracing like a femininity that hasn't really taken much of a seat in my work. So my work right now is flowers. If you would have told me a year ago I would have been making work with flowers, I would have told you were crazy. It's never occurred to me. I've never wanted to do it. I've always, I always thought that it was overdone. And now all of a sudden, that's just what I've been doing. And it was just finding in the spring and March and April is perfect time, just walking around my neighborhood and taking pictures of flower beds. And then I've been kind of working with them in a way that I'm using a technology, in a similar technology that operates the same way a virus would operate, in that it spreads and duplicates the photograph. It's called the content awareness algorithm, Phil. And so it operates in a way that's very similar to the virus. It just spreads. And so it's just these sprawling images of flowers.
Wow, that's so interesting. Anybody else?
Yeah, for me, it's interesting. I've always been kind of a person who works in spurts. And I think being in education, teaching during the year has always made it a little difficult to make work. And so I would get a lot of work done during the summer. And then I would have that to work on at night, basically, after I got home from work, to do those kinds of things. And because I had kind of developed that rhythm, the virus I have actually been more productive than I've ever been, because I have this sort of backlog of images like Kalee. I mean, one of the things that happened when I went out and photographed the landscape, I was also photographing other things. So I found that I had this huge catalog of cactus pictures and a huge catalog of flower pictures. And so, I've been working on cactus and flowers like Kalee. So, and it's nice that I've had this big backlog, but the pandemic needs to get over pretty soon, because I'm just about out of this.
That brings up something, Dick, that we've talked about, in that it is if you look at our Dick and my like history of the work we've made, it is ridiculously similar. It's like work he was making in the 70s. I made like maybe right after undergrad, and I was looking at some of his work and I was like, how is it possible that we make such similar work? It's really remarkable.
Yeah, she only found that out after a flood that hit our offices, and we were taking all of our work out of our offices, and she saw work of mine she had never seen before. And it's like, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, synchronicity.
Yeah.
I pivoted a lot of my studio tools and practice to make PPE during those initial early months. So that was really great to be able to use a lot of the tools that we're either using in our classroom or in our own studios to be able to kind of cover a stopgap for things like face shields and headbands and things like that. But it also, you know, being indoors and quarantining allowed me to escape into kind of endless landscapes in gaming, and that's taken the form of you know, some responses that I'm making in a game called Red Dead Redemption, which is kind of focused around, you know, the fictional West, but is interesting to me because it has a score that is generative kind of from spaghetti westerns and, you know, Italian cinema, just because the American West doesn't necessarily have a recorded sound that is evident. So they're kind of sourcing from what we think of when we think of the American West from movies and television. And so that's kind of fascinating to me, seeing how that translates into this, you know, endless digital vista.
Yeah. Cool. Chris, do you want to?
We have about, oh, excuse me. We have about 10 minutes left in our programming. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind providing your answer to Lee's last question, and then I'll hand it over to Emma Thompson to facilitate our audience questions.
So last spring break, right before spring break, I'd mixed a bunch of clay. I've always made little things and big things. Well, for the spring break, I was going to make a larger than life deer, and I mixed the clay for it, and then we shut down. So just last November, I mixed another batch of clay, and I've started that project. But during the shutdown, the very first thing I ran out of was Elmer's glue. So we had a lot of rice. We always keep a lot of rice. We buy rice in large quantities. So I made rice glue, and I'm not ever going back to Elmer's.
Very cool.
So thank you, Lee, and thank you to our panelists for the prepared questions. Emma, how are we doing with the questions from the audience?
We have so many amazing questions. I want to apologize in advance for any that we don't get to. I tried to pick one for each artist. Let's start with Chris. So Chris, how do you think your worldview is different in considering everything around you is material for your art?
That's huge. I love that question. How is my worldview different? It's the only worldview I've ever known. I would need a follow-up question. I love that question though. Yeah. I've been fiddling here, just rearranging the stuff on the TV tray next to me, you know. I like to order and organize, well, not organize like most people think organize, but I like to set things the way I want to see them, or to make a little something. I've been, while everybody's talking, just keep my mind focused, I've been drawing, you know. It's just what I do. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that was a great question. Nick, I know the Drone Boys video is installed in a very interesting way in the gallery. Can you comment on the material/sculptural aspect of Site Marfa Gold Ghost's physical installation?
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of a cairn. So going back to Dick's explanation, this kind of Scottish Gaelic word, but essentially how many, many different civilizations have used a stacked or arranged series of rocks or found objects in the landscape to function as a boundary of a location or a trail marker, or as a site of protection, etc. And so what Adam and I have done with some of our video works that we've produced together is use items that maybe have been on these exploratory journeys or have been found in the landscape and make their way back into the idea of this cairn. So you see not only the monitor, but things like flagging tape that we may use to draw in the landscape, or instruments that we may use to measure or record for later study, things like a camera. And then again, juxtaposed with this, high technology or things that you don't want to drop in the water category, are our most often used tools, which would be like a stick that's taped together. And I can't count the number of times that we've taped a camera or a microphone to things that are found in the landscape to gain that extra bit of reach, or to lower something into an interesting section of geography that we think is worth exploring, but at the same time you're forced to make tools from what you can find when you're on that trail or in that specific location. So some of that will make its way back to these sites. And so this is kind of a gesture at that, where when you unload the car or your bike or whatever you have at the end of the day, we're kind of turning out our pockets for this small stack of arranged objects. Thank you.
Awesome. Dick, do you think that the content of your work would have differed had you not grown up where you did?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's very much sort of response to that. I mean, there's a body of work I did a long time ago that's quite large. It was really based on sort of family tales. And, I always thought that body of work was called Allegories for Modern Times, but it was about these sort of family stories about how the family got here and how tough it was and all of that. So if none of that had happened here, I'm not sure I would have gotten the same kind of at least mythic things. Texas is big and has its own set of myths, and I totally bought into it, and it's all part of the family thing. So if I'd grown up in Connecticut, it's hard to imagine that the work would be the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And our final question is for Kalee. The way that you installed Autumn Trail, Moon Trail seems simultaneously effortless and very specifically placed. How did you decide to display that piece?
My main concern was to show that it has two sides. That was just the biggest concern, because I had found this collection of used photographic backdrops in a used photography store, and I immediately just fell in love, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're double-sided, that makes it better. And the imagery on them were just, the transition of the imagery being gorgeous to being cliche to being so bad it's good was kind of what had happened, or like how I kind of saw these backdrops, and just I was like, oh my gosh, I'm sure I sat in front of that as a 2-year-old at Sears, and I just the fact that they were double-sided, I was like, I have to display this in some way. And so this actually came before photographing it, that I tried arranging them on the ground, and because they have memory, they were rolled for so long, that's how they're stored. They just inherently had this like curve to them, and it was really hard to crumple them because they're so thick. And every time I did, I'd mar it, and I'd kind of hurt the vinyl itself. And so it just naturally wanted to be this shape. It just organically. and I knew I wanted to put them in a gallery. I knew that's the first, right when I saw them, I was like, these need to be seen by the masses. And this was the only way that you could see both sides. So that's my answer.
We actually have time for one more question. We have a last minute question that kind of addresses everybody. As the possibility of the pandemic ceases to background noise, do you all plan to return to previous studio subjects, or has the pandemic changed your art practice? Great question.
I'll start because see everybody else is pondering really hard. You know, for me, it's kind of interesting. I've been working on this body of work for a long time. I mean, it's a decade. And, you know, sometimes it's hard to know when you're at the end of something, but I feel like I'm getting near the end of this. And so I feel like there may be something new on the horizon. And so, I'm not sure what it is, but I think the thing is, like all of us, we're all naturally curious people. Just about everything, the natural world, science, politics. I mean, we're there. And so you know, I feel like I may not do this much longer, but I'm really looking forward to whatever it is that's coming next. And it'll be great if it can be pandemic free. Yes.
I would say that arcades and libraries are a big part of my studio mentality. So I'm really excited to have the possibility of going back to some of those shared public spaces that are so important when I'm wrestling with a difficult problem in the studio or a new material or a new challenge. So it's really just where some of these shared community spaces, which I guess will be part of some of the conversations in the next couple of weeks here, are exciting to me. The prospect of being able to revisit that under maybe, you know, being able to appreciate it a little more.
I think I'll always return to landscape, whether it's just for me when I travel somewhere, or, you know, whether I end up making work about it in the future. I have some ideas for a future series, and I think I have a tendency to move on too quickly. So I'm going to try to force myself to stick with what I'm doing right now for at least a little bit longer. And then I want to move on to something that for me is really different. And I feel my ideas, the idea that I have in mind feels very different for me. It feels challenging. It feels like I'm going to be breaking my own rules. It feels not dangerous by any means, but it feels like, oh, this is so not Kalee. And so that's kind of why I want to do it, is just to try like something different and shake things up a little bit in my studio practice.
So I know I've really been changed over the last year, but when I view my work, it seems like I'm constantly doing something new, something different, and it doesn't seem to relate to what I did before. But then my sister, who's known me as long as anybody, she's known me all my life, she says, Chris, why do you just make the same things over and over and over? So it's somewhere in between those two things of me thinking that I'm constantly changing and always making the same thing. So I imagine it'll be a lot the same.
Well, thank you everybody for your great questions from the audience, and to our panelists and to our moderator for your insight, and so that we could learn more about both your artwork, but then also the way that you think about your art. I think that that's what is the most fascinating part for me in both organizing this show and with my fellow classmates, is learning about you all and how you see the world and understanding it through your art. So thank you so much for for participating, and thank you, Lee, for moderating our panel. It's been great to work with you all. So we are having 2 more sessions for the remaining categories of our exhibition. So the next one will be the self category. That's next Tuesday. It's the same time, same place. We'll have different artists, of course, who were participating in that theme. And then our final one is on February 16th. So 2 Tuesdays from now, and that will be focused on community. So hope to see you all there and have a great evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.